Festival of the Future. We're halfway through the third and final day now. It's going so well. We've got lovely festival weather still here in Dorset. No mud, no wellies, none of that kind of problem that you get at other festivals. And really nice to welcome people from across Dorset and beyond. We've got at least one person from Northern Ireland, maybe more, joining us today. Welcome to you all to Dorset and to Festival of the Future. A few little rules in the chat. If you want to post a question, please pop it in the chat, and at the end we'll have a chance for you to unmute yourself and ask your question, and Nicola will be able to answer. Please feel free to tweet about your experience of joining Festival of the Future using the hashtag Futurefest. That would be great. We look forward to engaging with you on social media, and follow us on at Digital Dorset there too. That would be great too. I think that's the rules out of the way, and the welcome. So Nicola is from BT. She's been looking at this topic, which is essential to us all, especially over the last 6 months or so. The workplace of the future, how our workplaces have changed over the last 6 months. What are they going to look like in future? How are we going to take forward what we're learning from this experience into designing workplaces of the future that suit us and suit our employers? Nicola, I'm going to shut up now. I've said enough. Over to you. Share your slides, and away you go.
Thank you very much, Penny. So hello, everybody. For those of you from Dorset, hello, especially because I went to Bournemouth University. I spent 3 very happy years on the coast, and got to explore Dorset a lot. And I'm a Somerset girl originally, so not too far away either. Although actually I am talking to you today from my kitchen in Ipswich. So I will reveal why I'm in Ipswich in a minute. But I did used to be, I mean, this is a festival of the future. So I guess I'm kind of in the right place, because I did used to be BT's futurologist. Now, you will notice my job title has got a lot more boring recently. So I'm no longer officially a futurologist, mainly because I got really fed up of the question that everyone kept asking me. And I can even feel the question coming through the camera at me, which is, do you have a crystal ball? Well, the answer to that is yes, I do. Someone actually very kindly gave me one, but I can also tell you that it doesn't work. So I do have to work slightly harder for my living than reading tea leaves and looking at crystal balls. And that would be a very boring job, frankly. And although my job title is boring, my job most definitely isn't. So a little bit of background. So I work for BT's innovation team. Now, quite a lot of you probably don't know that BT does innovation, and part of my role is to raise people's awareness, and that, to be honest, is also one of the reasons why I'm standing in my kitchen in Ipswich, because I am based at Adastral Park. Adastral Park is just outside Ipswich, and Adastral Park is kind of the hub, I guess, of BT's research and innovation ecosystem. But it is an ecosystem like most large corporates. We have a whole ton of partners around us, whether they're suppliers or startups or own people. Obviously, I mean, Adastral is a very rich source of fantastic research in itself. We are the 3rd largest, in fact, in research and innovation in the UK. Now, my job largely, there's a few things I do that are slightly quirky. Firstly, we have a really extensive network of academic partners. Actually, Bournemouth University are an academic partner of us, but they're not working with me on this project, sadly. But I have been working with MIT over in Boston, Cambridge University. In the past, we've done quite a lot with London Business School. You'll see some stuff from Lancaster University as well that we've been doing. So partially my job is to work with them. on the research bit, but I am also, I call it a speed dating service. So a lot of my role is to actually include customers in our innovation ecosystem. So actually working with large UK corporates, global corporates to a certain extent as well, and public sector, really around, well, what issues are you finding and how could we potentially speed date you with some of those wonderful ecosystem partners to help solve your problems. Now, I also, as a bit of background, my degree at Bournemouth was applied psychology and computing. So I always say I'm half a technologist, but most of me is a social scientist. And I am relatively unique in the team in terms of looking at everything from a people-centered perspective. So I always claim that I'm looking at the most disruptive part of innovation, which is, of course, not the technology, it's us. And you can kind of see that already in this massive global experiment that we are currently doing, because home working, for example, has been around for a very long time. Our first experiments in home working in BT, in fact, one of my first projects in BT back in 1992, believe it or not, was our very first home working trial. So it's taken us, nearly 30 years to really mass adopt it. And that's not, I mean, to be honest, the technology wasn't really there in 92. It has been there for probably about 5 years now. And if you want to look at the positive side, we're kind of at the perfect point to have a pandemic, if there is such a thing, because a lot of the technologies are there. So we've got things like cloud, we've got things like video, we've got collaboration tools, we've got pretty good connectivity, whether that's 4G, eventually 5G, or broadband or Wi-Fi. So we can actually work in lots of different ways. But in terms of looking at the future of work, which I have been looking at for, actually I've been running this project in various forms for about 10 years now. But, just trying to figure out, what are the trends driving the future of work has been an obsession of mine. And all of those trends I'm going to talk about today begin with the letter D. And I have no idea why, aside from the fact I'm a massive Sesame Street fan. So I always like to say this session comes at you by the letter D. So you're going to see some of these Ds as we go along. There's one particular D that's pretty relevant at the moment, and that D is disruption. And it's quite interesting because, prior to the pandemic hitting, a lot of the thinking around the future of work was that the big disruptor was going to be AI and automation. And I will talk about AI and automation towards the end of the presentation. But oddly enough, it wasn't that changed the way that we worked. It was something smaller and a lot more microbial. So, I mean, what I'm trying to do at the moment is a lot of the trends haven't changed, but what we've seen, and I'm sure everyone knows this because it's not rocket science, is we've seen an absolute acceleration of digital. As one of the MIT professors put it, a bullet train has been shot through strategy. So we've seen so much change in the past 6 months. Some people have said, between 5 and 7 years worth of acceleration in terms of disruption and digital. So, I mean, what I'm doing at the moment is I'm picking data, and there's a lot of data out there from what I like to term a massive global work from home experiment. And to be perfectly honest, as an academic, this is fascinating because it's the first time ever we've been able to study this at scale globally. And there's some absolutely fascinating stuff coming out. Now, the obvious stuff is that we have had to shift a lot more to homework. So in the UK, we've seen home working typically rise by about 20%. It's working for some people, not so much for others. More on that in a minute. We have had, interesting shifts in our working day. Obviously, the commute means that we start maybe slightly later, but maybe we partition our days in slightly different ways. And certainly, a lot of people are reporting that home working is producing on average around 20% extra productivity from their workers. Now, that's an interesting one because I'll talk about productivity in a minute, but largely what we're seeing is that productivity is mainly because we're working longer. So a Harvard study that was published a couple of weeks ago, very, very extensive global one, was showing that on average we're working around 48 minutes a day more than we did when we were office based. But there are some benefits. Obviously, employees even prior to the pandemic, were asking for more agility and flexibility in how, where, and when that they work. And I think that demand has gone up now. Now we've got a flavour of it. We really do like that flexibility. So, I mean, we've got disruption, and I think that's firstly on a technical level. But we've also got a lot of other things going on, including this second D, which is digital. This concept of digital workplace, digital office, digital everything. And again, the talk around that had started prior to the pandemic as well. So I was working with a lot of customers in both public and private sector around digital workplace initiatives. And indeed, BT has its own digital workplace initiative as well. So, and people have different definitions as to what a digital workplace is. Now, I guess my instinct was to say, okay, if we want to change the way that we work, because that's the implication on digital, what actually do we want to achieve? So we did a survey, and I've just got my hands on the new data for this. This was about 18 months ago. We asked key decision makers around the world and IT decision makers, what did they want from their digital workplace schemes? And again, this isn't rocket science, that if we're going to reinvent the way that we work, we probably want to reinvent it to help our employees become more rather than less productive. Brilliant. Okay, so that's where we want to get to. The trouble then is, how do we define productivity? The trouble is, a lot of the measures that we use for productivity were derived back in the industrial era, where we had factories where there was inputs and distinct output. We manufactured widgets. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think I've ever manufactured a widget because I am a knowledge worker. And to be honest, one of the biggest beneficiaries of the work from home experiment has been the knowledge worker. But the knowledge worker is incredibly difficult to measure. And what we tend to do is we use proxies to measure instead. So things like time is a great proxy. I can see that I'm working maybe 48 minutes longer per day. But actually, is that equating to productivity? And typically the answer to that is no. Because if we look at long hours cultures, for example, we can see that they become less rather than more productive. The reasons are easy to fathom. We get tired. And actually, one of the biggest dangers of homework is burnout, because actually working 48 minutes a day longer, if we do that over a sustained period of time, we tend to get a lot of stress and burnout. So that can be a massive problem. So I think one of the fundamental things we need to ask ourselves is, are we measuring the right things in terms of productivity? Now, this is not a question I am going to definitively answer, because frankly, it's a complex question. And again, I turn to a lot of big brains in our university partners to try and figure out, well, what could we measure then? Michael Schrage at MIT has come up with this really intriguing notion of return on idea. Now, if I'm a knowledge worker, what's my primary output? Well, it is probably ideas. So his idea is to try and see how ideas are promulgated and propagated across an organization. How we measure that, I don't think he knows either, but it's a really intriguing concept. But we're also getting increased talk about allying productivity with well-being. Again, if you've got a population that's working well, in other words, mental health is good, physical health is good, and they're engaged in their job, you're probably going to get a productive workforce. So again, lots of discussions around whether well-being could be used as a productivity proxy. Watch this space on that one, I would say. But I would also say that one of my biggest anxieties around the digital workplace, particularly at the moment, is that we need to also fundamentally rethink our culture, because technology has powered us along really nicely. And as I said, it's accelerated the changes in work styles that we're seeing. But we know culture moves a lot more slowly. And although we've seen a really impressive adaptation of the workforce, my worry is, can this be sustained? So there are a few things, I think, particularly about leadership that we need to think about. The first one is, as Linda Grattan at London Business School has been talking about for a number of years, around the concept of leaders trusting by default. So if they can't see their employees, trust them to work rather than micromanaging them, because micromanagement, A, is a bad way of managing, but is almost impossible in a remote organization. Indeed, Christine Derry at MIT has been talking about this notion of checking up and checking in on employees. So rather than micromanaging them, making sure that we communicate very regularly with them to make sure that they are okay for a start and engaged and they know what they're doing and they have a sense of purpose. Obviously, rather than measuring the number of hours, we need to look at the output that people are producing rather than, you know, oh, I work a 36-hour week, because that, to be honest, has nothing to do with my productivity. But I think it's become quite apparent that, you know, the curtain has been pulled back on leadership, and leadership has become more important than ever in remote organizations. But I think managers and leaders are finding it hard. I'm sure many of you are finding it very hard. Now, we've done quite a lot of interviews around contact centres recently. Contact centres are particularly fascinating because good leaders in the contact centre space actually usually manage by walking around. You know, that they'll look out and see, you know, are people struggling? Are they okay? They'll go and sit by them and sort out problems. They cannot do that when they can't see their teams. So although it's not impossible to do, it's much, much harder because you have to be proactive all the time and you have to use the digital tools. Also, I think leaders need to create a sense of purpose amongst their employees. And that also means that they need to be good storytellers. And that links in with things like culture. Culture, again, is easy to build when you're in an office and you've got all your branding around you and you can observe behaviours. When you're not in an office, leaders need to make, you know, call out good behaviours, call out bad behaviours as well, but try and make that culture very explicit. And that can be quite hard to do. And we know that certain things like onboarding, if you're a new employee, again, a lot of that culture is absorbed by being in the office. So again, you have to work slightly harder to get those guys engaged. But I would say my ultimate anxiety at the moment is what I call horrible hybrids. And we learned this in BT because BT was a very early adopter of home working. I think there were a fair percentage of our employees working permanently from home by the year 2000. Obviously, we didn't start quite as early as 92. That was the initial experiment. But I think we learned that it's very easy to get this horrible hybrid where you've got the office dwellers and you've got the remote workers, and they can become two tribes. And as Frankie Goes to Hollywood said, two tribes can very easily go to war if there's a them and us culture. Even perceptions around, well, I need to be in the office because I won't get promoted, I won't get included in conversations, so I feel like I need to be in the office to do that. That needs to be changed in a remote organisation. But even down to the way that we collaborate as well. I'm sure we've been in horrible hybrid meetings where, you know, half the meeting is in a physical office, half the meeting is remote. And really, you know, particularly the remote people tend to often get cut out of the conversation entirely. Actually, what we found in this massive experiment is that digital's a great leveler. So in actual fact, if you've got a mixture of people physically co-located and people remote, the answer to holding a good meeting is to hold it in digital space as a default. And that means I'm going to be sitting probably in a meeting room on something like a video conference alongside everybody else on a video conference, which, so why am I in the office is a very, very big question. And indeed, my next E, which I call the Death of Dilbert. Dilbert's not dead, obviously, because he's a very sweet little cartoon character. But I think we have been, even prior to the pandemic, there had been a lot of discussions as to whether the office is dead. And there have been headlines recently. You know, a lot of the major city businesses are not renewing their leases or downsizing their offices. And I think CFOs especially are looking around at their office estate and going, well, productivity doesn't seem to have been affected here. And I've got a lot of expensive real estate, which, well, maybe I can close it. Now, I don't think offices are dead because I think offices had been changing prior to the pandemic. They have a short to medium term function, which is slightly weird. And then I think in the future, they will return to being what I call places. Well, we're social creatures, so they're places where we communicate, we collaborate, and we build community. That is the primary function of an office, not necessarily a place that we work. However, what we're finding is that generally when we look at home working, it's working for about 70% of people, although there is a very strong desire amongst about 60% of the population to occasionally be in an office, but not necessarily 5 days a week. But there is a 30% segment of the population where home working is really not working. And typically those people who are struggling fall into a number of camps. They are often younger. They are often urban based. In other words, their houses are they're in shared houses or with a younger population. Sometimes they're living with their parents, so they don't necessarily have a good environment to work in. We're also finding on personality types, extroverts are struggling a lot more than introverts because extroverts tend to draw their energy from the office and people around them. Parents, particularly when schools are closed, we're struggling a lot more than people without children for obvious reasons. So we can't just paint a one-size-fits-all scenario. To those CFOs, I have to say, think about that 30%, because in the short term, when we're looking at COVID-safe offices are places where those 30% go to work because they simply cannot be productive from home. But we also have to manage numbers down. I think BT at the moment is looking at a maximum 40% capacity in our buildings. So we have to manage expectations. We have to make sure that one of the biggest problems is that before the pandemic, people used to come in maybe 3 days a week, but they wouldn't come in on a Monday and a Friday. So the building was empty. If we're having to manage a 40% rota system, we need to encourage people to come in on a Monday and a Friday, and that can be quite difficult. So, we need to think about our spaces in a short to medium term is probably places where we might need to do heads down work, but eventually we'll go back to socializing, collaborating and creating community in them. But there are a lot of other discussions going on. I tweeted something yesterday about the notion of the 15-minute city, which has been around for a while, actually, but places like Paris have been discussing whether co-working spaces might be an interesting option to the 2-hour commute into a centralized office HQ. So they have particularly in Paris, we all have a climate crisis to solve, but Paris has an air pollution crisis, again, prior to the pandemic, that they need to manage. So the notion of the 15-minute city is, can I have pretty much everything I need to live and work within a cycle ride or a walk away? Now, the practicalities of that probably fall down, because I don't think, unless you live in Bournemouth, you probably won't necessarily have a university on your doorstep. But certainly in terms of workplaces, co-working spaces could be an interesting one. And to be honest, again, they had popped up all over the place before the pandemic, and could well be a quite convenient place if you want to get out of the house, frankly. But I think a lot of this is about choice. And as we get more choices, and obviously depending on lockdowns and things like that, our choices may be restricted to home. But as we get more choices, yeah, probably we do want to go into the office occasionally. But the coffice, as I like to call it, the co-working hub, is also quite a viable solution. To be honest, that's where I used to work prior to the pandemic most of the time, because I only need, frankly, 2 things to work. I need coffee and I need chocolate. And actually maybe 3 things. I do quite like occasionally seeing other people, but I am an introvert. So I've adapted a lot better to home working than I thought I would. But I think long-term home working, as BT learnt, can be very difficult. So offering options and also not imposing a one-size-fits-all solution is probably our hybrid future. Let's just not create horrible hybrids. That links into diversity, which is my next D. Because one size doesn't fit all. We can absolutely see that different people have different notions of where they should work, how they work, and how productive they are. And again, we have learnt that digital, again, has become a great leveler in terms of people being able to access things like meetings and conferences. So previously to the pandemic, I would have had to have gone to Boston to collaborate with MIT. I've been talking to the MIT guys on an almost daily basis now without having to go to Boston. Brilliant. That's made all sorts of things accessible to me. But even down to the level, I have a lovely Scottish friend who's in a wheelchair, who got really frustrated that all the conferences she wanted to go to were in London. And it's quite difficult for someone in a wheelchair to actually get to a lot of those conferences. So she's seen a whole world of opportunity open up. But I think for organisations, there's a wider implication here. We want a diverse organisation because we want innovation within an organisation, and the two go together. Because if we have people that look the same, sound the same, come from the same place, probably not going to get any new ideas. So we want to embrace diversity, but that also implies we can't impose a one-size-fits-all way of working. The next D is distance. And to be honest, as a telecoms company, we've been trying to kill distance for a very long time. Have we succeeded? Well, kind of at the moment, but I think, going back to what people are missing, they're missing people because we're social creatures. So I think we've come to embrace the fact that face-to-face is incredibly valuable, but actually at the moment, not feasible to do on a massive level. But I think, we've understood the value of it now. It's by far the easiest way to create trust, for example, to create team dynamics, all of that lovely stuff. So we're not going to kill face-to-face, but I think it's really interesting to see what's coming out of this massive global experiment again, because far from becoming, very isolated and uncommunicative, what we're finding is that collaboration and communication, certainly with our direct teams, has gone up considerably. And whether that's more email, which could be a good or a bad thing, or indeed, as we can demonstrate today, a real lift in video collaboration. We're seeing 5 times the amount of Zoom over our network, for example, but the figures I've just got in shows a 300% increase in video collaboration across our customers. So, a lots more video meetings. Now, good and bad thing there, because we're having more meetings. They might be slightly shorter, but because they're frictionless and we don't have to travel and we don't have to move rooms and we don't have to book a room, indeed, the temptation is to fill our entire day with death by meeting days. And again, is that productive? And I think the big question we're seeing at the moment is when we study fully remote organizations, those that have been doing it prior to the pandemic, they don't do a lot of synchronous meetings. In other words, they don't do meetings a lot. What they do is they work asynchronously using chat, using shared spaces. And then when it gets to the point at which they need to discuss something, they then schedule a meeting. So I think there's an interesting dynamic around asynchronous versus synchronous here in terms of the ways that we collaborate. And it's not a problem with the tools. It's not video that's to blame. It's the meeting culture that we tend to have lifted and shifted from the analog world to the digital world. But there are a few things that we do miss. I hate the word serendipity because it implies I bump into people in corridors a lot and talk to them. I don't think I do an awful lot of that. Occasionally, yes, but I think it's that critical 10 minutes before the meeting and after the meeting that in a physical space we'd start, we'd be getting our coffee and biscuits and we'd have a one-to-one conversation with people. That's the bit that we're really missing, and that's often, the chunky, meaningful bit of the meeting, because actually digital is quite formal. We're scheduled, we're agendaed, and we don't get that informal time unless we schedule it again. So maybe we need to schedule a little bit more informal time in between meetings before we have those meetings. Of course, we can change the way that we meet and collaborate, and that's where sort of the more mainstream technology innovation conversation comes in. So using things like virtual reality or augmented reality to create a richer collaboration environment. Now, I'm extremely cynical about virtual reality. It doesn't work for me terribly well. I call it vomity reality because usually you need a bucket if you put a headset on me. Plus, I don't want to be fully immersed in a headset for 8 hours a day. But as you can see from the lovely picture of Nicola Sturgeon there with our CEO, Philip Janssen, there are some use cases, I think, that work with VR, and those primarily are in things like education. So I think, potentially we can use it, but maybe for short periods of time. But I do think augmented reality has started to come of age. And you can see a few examples here. And the one that we're really excited about is an application in healthcare, which again started before the pandemic, but culture has changed quite a lot during the pandemic. Now, you can see a guy there, he's a paramedic with an augmented reality headset on. What he is doing using 5G is broadcasting high definition real-time video signals to a remote medic or a doctor in the hospital who is wearing a VR headset. And that enables the medic or the doctor to literally see through the paramedic's eyes. There's also a haptic glove involved. A haptic glove transmits touch. So whatever the paramedic touches, the doctor can actually feel at the remote end. So the idea behind that largely is, firstly, the paramedic can do more supervised procedures with the doctor remote. Secondly, we might be able to reduce the number of hospital admissions. And thirdly, if we do have to take to hospital, the medic is already up to speed with the case, so it reduces the amount of time. Now, again, we got pushback initially about that one. A lot of the medics were going, well, I quite like to see the patient. Now they're going, no, I quite like not to see the patient. Let's see how much we can do remotely. So there's a lot we're doing around remote healthcare. With our engineers, you can see one of our engineers with a HoloLens on. We can do pretty much the same with them, overlaying plans using pattern recognition and matching to try and make some of that spaghetti that you can see in the cabinet there. Again, if he's a baby engineer, we can have a more experienced engineer looking through his eyes and talking him through procedures. The guy in the orange there is actually at Belfast Harbour. That's an application, a hands-free application, because that guy's a crane inspector. So we can get checklists up in front of his eye. Again, if he needs to get a second opinion or a sign off, again, a remote expert could come in. Eventually, maybe we'll also start to layer on other technologies. So again, AI, drones, all sorts of things potentially we could do to make his job easier. And then finally, to blow your mind slightly, because it blew mine, the guy in the blue there, the Chinese guy, is actually a miner. You heard it right. A miner. He is allegedly working from home, although that looks like a very, very interesting home. But that's an experiment that's going on in China, again with 5G. It looks as if he's got a very big games console in front of him. But in actual fact, what he's doing is driving mining equipment remotely. So you might think working from home is only a white collar thing. Yeah, think again. It might be a lot more blue collar stuff as we get a little bit more connectivity. Final 2Ds. This is one of the more challenging ones. I call it the Death of Dolly. This is Dolly Parton, who of course is not dead. She has a Christmas album out. I have bought that Christmas album, even though it's October. I'm a massive Dolly fan, but of course I'm talking the 9 to 5, not Dolly herself. So this is an interesting one because again, prior to the pandemic, we've been talking about, is Monday to Friday 9 to 5 the most productive way of working? And I think we've seen that we're not doing Monday to Friday 9 to 5 at the moment. And to be honest, we've been doing a lot of work, particularly around this notion that Kevin Kelly talks about around the fact the problem of the future is not connection, it's disconnection. When do we find the off switch? And particularly since we are now living at work, literally, that burnout problem I mentioned earlier is a real issue. So this links into well-being. The stuff you can see here is actually work that's been done by Lancaster University on techno-stress. And they've been looking at all sorts of aspects of this. So the fact that our technology encourages us to multitask. Multitasking is terrible for productivity, particularly for complex tasks. So maybe our technology is distracting us to death and maybe not making us more productive under certain circumstances. So maybe we need to single task and turn some of it off occasionally. Then, of course, you know, we've had to adapt really fast to digital technologies over the past few months, but they might not be as intuitive as they should be. So again, how do we handhold people who aren't confident using technologies? Then there is a pressure to be always on. Again, with a lot of home workers, they feel guilty if they take a break. They shouldn't, because actually taking a break can make you significantly more productive. But again, those little things like smartphones that are always on and always on us keep us tethered to the office, even if we're walking the dog. And again, working with Cambridge University, we developed something called the Balanced Communication Diet for Business, which is a bit of a mouthful, but the Cambridge diet was taken. So, but it's a 5-step plan to better communications behaviour, which includes how do I find the off switch? How do I redefine boundaries when those boundaries have disappeared? Then we've got techno insecurity, and that's on 2 levels now. The first level is we know we are entering very tough economic times. There's a lot of talk of a depression rather than a recession. So people are paranoid about losing their job. And that behavior means that, or that worry means that we tend to try and demonstrate that we're really valuable and we're working really hard. And again, there might be a guilt to not be available. That's bad, again, bad for productivity. But on the second level of paranoia is my last D, which is that automation and AI thing that was supposed to be driving the future of work. So the droid is an interesting one. And this was a survey we did of senior execs last year. around, you know, just the paranoia associated with the hype, the fact that the robots might rise and take my job. They probably won't, by the way, because largely AI is quite dumb. I am slightly disturbed that 37% agree that they'd rather talk to a robot than their boss, but I think that's a leadership challenge rather than anything else. Because actually, I don't think this is an argument around man versus machine or human versus machine, because I think inevitably some of most jobs are like jigsaw puzzles, and certain of those pieces have a lot of data and process and rules associated with them. And frankly, those are the jobs you automate. But actually, there's a lot of things that we're really good at doing that make us superpowered and make us very human. So everything from empathy, caring, complex problem solving. We can do anarchy and chaos. We can fill in gaps where there's no data. Machines find that really difficult to do. And I don't think there's a huge overlap. So rather than calling it AI, artificial intelligence, let's call it AI augmented intelligence, because the power comes when we ally human and machine together, as Albert Einstein allegedly says. Actually, if you put the two of us together, you get something really, really remarkable. So those were just some of the Ds that we're seeing shape the workplace of the future. There are quite a few Ds, actually, that I had to miss out in the interest of time. But if you are interested in any of that, I have lots of research. So if you're having trouble sleeping, just ping me. I have got tons and tons of bits of research that address all sorts of things, from how to homework effectively through to how do I turn off the balanced communication diet for business, and also where we think the office of the future might be going. So I think we haven't got a huge amount of time for questions, but if anyone does have any, I am happy to try and answer them. Thanks for listening.
Nicola, there's been so much love for you in the chat bar. Lots of people are really enjoying this session. Lots of comments. I haven't actually seen questions so much as lots of comments and people adding their own views and their own experiences in there. Another one, such a great session. Thank you. Would anybody like to ask a question? Perhaps just unmute yourself and launch right in.
Hi, Nicola. This is Eddie.
Hello.
Hi, I work for IBM UK Labs. And the question I have for you is quite simple. I'll make it as concise as I can. So I live in a tiny little village just outside Maidenhead. And in this tiny little village, I noticed that there used to be 13 pubs in this village, and long ago, which meant that the population used to be much bigger. And the reason why that changed is because the Industrial Revolution arrived, and all the people who worked in the farms picking up vegetables, they were effectively made redundant because of the industrial age and early threshing machines and a plough, right? And all of those people who used to live in this village effectively moved into factories to work on assembly lines. And there they remained for like 200 years or so. And then eventually they migrated into offices to do the same repetitive work there until word processors. We're at the point now where we're looking at AI and automation. Do you think that is the next industrial revolution? And when do you think it's going to arrive? And how does that affect us in the workplace?
So very, very, very astute question. I think it is really quite interesting around the dynamics of how our technology has shaped our society, and you know, the Industrial Revolution was the last major revolution, and I think we've been talking about this new technological revolution for quite a long time, and I think COVID has accelerated a lot of that. Now, the extent to which we automate, it's intriguing talking to some of our partners at Imperial College, some economists I've been talking to, particularly around what happens after we have tough economic times. And then one of the outcomes is more automation. And I think we're starting to see that in certain areas. So I know in factories, for example, particularly in China, we've seen more robots being deployed. And there are some obvious reasons for that. Robots don't get sick. They don't need to social distance. But that doesn't eliminate humans. What it tends to do is to change the skill sets that humans So when we look at factories, there has been a slight reduction in headcount, but largely what's happened is the guys that used to work on the assembly line are now working to maintain and quality control the robots. So the skills have shifted. But I think there's an interesting one, particularly when we start to talk about where we work. And this isn't anything necessarily to do with AI and automation, but obviously the key thing about COVID is that urban centres have suffered. And if we're only going into an office after this pandemic, whenever that might be, maybe 1 or 2 times a week, urban centres are still going to suffer. But I keep saying the money goes somewhere. So there's a lot of, again, a lot of research going around. Well, are we effectively going back to moving into a more rural location with bigger houses? Maybe it depends where you live, but potentially cheaper, bigger houses, and are sort of more hyper-local communities starting to benefit from an urban migration. So I think there's an interesting dynamic because cities have a huge amount of power. And I can't see that declining so much, although they've taken a hit under COVID. So I think cities have got to work hard around why would they attract people to live and work there. But I think there's also a really interesting opportunity for communities, particularly in places like Dorset, around saying, well, there's a lot of real nice things like countryside and fresh air that can attract people, and they can actually do a job, a knowledge job, that enables them to live in a nice circumstance, and they don't have to commute every day. So I think there's an interesting dynamic shift there that has more to do with the technology that we work with and the way that work is developing, rather than necessarily about AI.
Thank you. I guess the last comment. Thank you very much for that. I really enjoyed your presentation today. Do you think, apart from the location and the work environments that we work in, which is very important, do you think that there's another thing that's going on here, that the shackles that were put on our hands when the industrial age arrived, effectively putting us into repetitive process work on the assembly line and then in the office? Do you think now that all of that will be automated, as you say, by artificial intelligence, etc.? Are you ready for this? That society will return to what we actually are, which is inquiring, creative human beings?
That's the utopian view. There's a dystopian view as well, which as a futurist you have to kind of take into both. I'm an optimist, so I hope, yes, the idea is that technology should free us up to do the stuff that's actually interesting and meaty. The trouble is, actually, to date, what has happened with technology is it's largely, I guess, hyper-accelerated things and made us busier, which means that sometimes we don't have the time to actually do what we want to do. Actually, I've just been reading a fascinating book about time and how we use our time, and how that, actually time deprived we tend to be, and how do we manage time better. I think that in itself, because time is a productivity proxy, that we often mistake busyness for productivity, and I think sometimes we probably need to make ourselves slightly less busy in order to actually achieve a lot of the things that we need, not just in work but outside work as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot up for grabs at the moment in terms of rethinking the ways that we work.
Thank you very much.
Good question there. We also have a question from Christine. Now we're running up against our deadline, and I am going to have to leave shortly. So Christine, would you like to ask a question, and I'll ask Nicola to answer it really quickly, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Nicola, fabulous presentation. I've really enjoyed it. Just a question around diversity, and you made that lovely comment that diversity enables innovation to a fabulous extent, and I'm a complete believer in that. How, in this new environment, we're digitised, people are working in their homes are often, particularly thinking about ability diversity, more an enabling environment that potentially workplaces, or particularly transport to workplaces, are. How can organisations benefit from this, and where could they get that wrong in order to bring in underutilised time and voices and capability in the community today, both customer and workplace? Sorry.
Yeah, I think that the sort of notion of communities and community working is again, we were having a discussion the other day around the sort of innovation, the geolocated innovation ecosystems that typically tend to happen amongst tech startups, and that we don't necessarily do that for all industries, although pharma occasionally do that as well. But how do we get a much more localized, cohesive community where, it drives the vibrancy of that community, but it also, obviously with climate change, it means that we don't have to commute. It's much more inclusive. I know we have done a bit of work with a large retailer a couple of years back around community hubs, particularly with communities who were struggling around work-life balance and caring. So could that, again, they didn't have to commute a very long way, so they could kind of juggle a lot of their caring responsibilities, but also get out of the house, but also get a job, which actually they've been finding quite difficult because most of the jobs were in urban areas and required a commute. So can we start to create sort of community hubs to actually, get people who want to be in work but can't for, various reasons in terms of their other commitments? How do we actually offer a little bit more flexibility that enables them to potentially work in a much more hyper local way, but not necessarily from home, because that might not work for them. So I think there's a lot, again, we can be very creative around how we could potentially, re-energize high streets, for example. I mean, that's one thing that's been discussed, as well as I've always said, high streets probably do need to look at, well, whether they could co-locate workspaces, because workspaces then fuel, restaurants and cafes, and creates a much more vibrant high street than some of us are struggling in terms of our high streets locally. So what can we do to try and reinvigorate the area, but actually increase the diversity of the workforce as part of that?
Thank you, Nicola. This is such a fascinating discussion, and I get the sense that we could go on talking for at least another hour. There's so much to say. Thank you, but I am going to draw it to an end because there are other sessions running that we all need to get to. Thank you, Nicola, so much. It really has been one of the best sessions, I think, that I've been in during the festival. Really fantastic and great audience as well, and lovely engagement and fantastic questions from everybody attending. So thank you very much to all of you for your warm comments and suggestions and thoughts. Don't forget, we are recording this, so if anybody struggled to see the visuals, I know Sharon did, or has friends who'd like to see it, it will be up on the website soon. Tweet, pop something in the chat, use the hashtag Futurefest, and come back when we have our next festival event. And I hope, Nicola, that maybe we can entice you back and do more talking with Digital Dorset, maybe join one of our podcasts or something, because this has been such a great session. Thank you very much indeed. I am going to rush off now, but cheerio everybody, and thanks for coming.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you, Nicola. That was really good. Bye-bye.